Hi everyone. We'll just give people a few minutes to join us, but I'm excited to have you here today and join us in this webinar. Right, I think we'll kick off now. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to you all. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners. If we can move to the next slide, actually, Belinda, thanks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today. I'm joining from Te Whanganui Aitara here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Welcome everyone from different countries who are joining us today, and acknowledge the deep connection of traditional owners to the land, water and culture, and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we will officially launch the Toward a Nature Positive Future for the Water Sector report, set it in context and then provide a high-level overview of the report content. I'm Dr. Kerry Griffiths. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council, and I'll be facilitating and moderating our session today. As you can see here, we have an agenda which will cover the key concepts, learnings from the UK, and also what do those learnings and lessons mean in the Australia and New Zealand context. There'll be time for questions at the end. So please add these into the chat as we progress through, and we'll address these following the presentations. I'm really honoured and excited to launch the Toward a Nature Positive Future for the Water Sector report, which has been developed in partnership between Jacobs and the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. Biodiversity loss is a global crisis that demands immediate action. Its consequences threaten ecosystems, economies, and the well-being of all life. Infrastructure investors and owners need to address the impacts and dependencies on nature of their organisations and assets. And this report provides valuable insights into approaches to do so. The infrastructure sustainability rating tools have always focused on enhancing natural capital outcomes. Over the last 18 months, the ISC has increased our focus on the nature positive agenda through our work on the Task Force on Nature-related Disclosures, our upcoming Nature and Finance Bootcamp, and today through this report developed specifically for the water sector. Next slide, thanks, Belinda. The report development was led by Emma Dade and Prey Wonthong from Jacobs Australia, with contributions from Valerie Robertson, Jacobs UK, and members of the ISC team, including Jane Nichols and myself. I'd like to acknowledge Yarra Valley Water for their insightful local case study that's also included within the report. Let me now introduce Emma and Valerie, who will provide an overview of the report content. And after those introductions, we're going to have a short poll that we'll ask you to participate in. Emma is a recognised sustainability leader across Australia and New Zealand and spearheads sustainability integration across Jacobs projects and strategies as Technical Director of Sustainable Development and ESG. With extensive experience spanning water, transport, cities, energy and resources, Emma drives the integration of sustainability and climate resilience into planning and delivery of major infrastructure programs. She is a key contributor to industry best practice initiatives, including the use of the IS rating for over a decade now. In the water sector, Emma champions the adoption of sustainable and nature-based approaches, helping utilities embed this into governance, planning and delivery. Her strategic insight and systems thinking, combined with her deep understanding of sustainability drivers and enablers, make her a powerful voice in shaping a nature-positive future for infrastructure. Emma will cover key concepts first and then move on later to making that connection to Australia and New Zealand. We're really privileged to have Valerie Robertson join us from the United Kingdom. Valerie is a Senior Associate Director of Economics with 18 years experience and the subject matter expert for Jacobs on environmental economics. Valerie specialises in environmental valuation and economic appraisal and currently leads on various economic, natural capital and social value assessments. She's developed and has developed and applied approaches for valuing the environmental and social costs of water resource management schemes and provided technical assurance on the natural capital, biodiversity and societal valuation aspects of water sector business plans. With an academic background in environmental science, climatology and sustainability, Valerie has also contributed to a number of strategic projects on ESG and the climate emergency, including advising Jacobs water sector clients on adopting TNFD requirements. So I think you'll agree with me that we have some great people here today who are going to be sharing their knowledge with us. Before we move on to Emma, we're just going to run a quick poll, and that poll will give us some insights into the knowledge of the participants in the room. It's exciting to see so many of you joining us here today, and it will just give us a bit of a feel for what the people joining us today, how you would rate your knowledge and understanding of natural capital. So if you can just fill in the poll as it's come up onto the screen now, and that will help us to get a feel for who's in the room. It's great to see those come up, and we can see already that there's quite a bit of knowledge, but more in the general knowledge, limited knowledge space, somewhat knowledgeable and not too many experts. So you've come to the right place. And let me then hand over, firstly now, thanks so much for completing the poll, and let me hand over now to Emma, who's going to be taking us through the key concepts. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you. Thanks, Kerry. We're really pleased to be here today to launch the paper and share some of the key insights with you all. So if we move on to the next slide, I really wanted to start with some of the key terms and concepts that underpin what we're talking about here. I find there's a lot of different nature-related terms and language that's being used, and it's important to define these. So when we talk about natural capital, we're referring to the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources that provide valuable goods and services essential to sustain economic activity and life. These include things like air, water, soil, minerals, plants, animals, and the ecosystems they form, such as forests or wetlands. And from these natural assets flow a range of ecosystem services that contribute to our well-being, such as water and food supply, water filtration, nutrient cycling, or recreational services. These ecosystem services provide benefits and value to society, such as food security, potable water supply, and community cohesion. The extent of the natural assets we have and what condition they are in and where they are located determines the benefits and thus the value they provide. So when we talk about a natural capital approach, it's based on the principle that nature is a critical and measurable asset on par with human and financial capital that underpins the function of thriving businesses, economies, and societies. It represents a means for identifying and quantifying natural resources and associated ecosystem goods and services that can help integrate ecosystem-oriented management with economic decision-making and development. The approach recognises nature's crucial role in delivering the goods, services, and amenity that we all rely on. It can help organisations to assess needs, identify dependencies on natural assets and translate this into relevant information for decision making. And why are we interested in this? It's reported that half of the gross domestic product of both Australia and New Zealand is moderately or highly dependent on nature and the ecosystem services it provides. And so the importance of considering this capital in planning and decision making is critical. We move on to the next slide. So these ecosystem services can be categorized into 4 different service types. They have provisioning services like water and food supply, regulating services such as water filtration, flood regulation, supporting or bundled services like soil formation and nutrient cycling, and cultural services, which can include recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual values. So if we take an example from a non-operational woodland site that owned by a water utility in the UK. On the left image, you can see some of the ecosystem services highlighted there that it might provide, such as raw materials like timber, recreation for community, and carbon reduction. Under a natural capital approach, the value of the woodland is derived from 2 sources. Firstly, the financial value that the water utility would derive from developing or selling the land. And secondly, the natural capital value derived from the ecosystem services it provides to the businesses, local communities, and society. This might include carbon sequestration, mitigation of flood risk, and community recreation opportunities. So on the right-hand side of the slide, is a fairly simple example showing the benefit and value associated with one of these ecosystem services. And while we aren't going into the details here on the monetization of the benefits, you can see on the image the benefit of carbon sequestered by the woodland measured in tonnes and the value of that in financial terms. So on to the next slide. So why is natural capital important and relevant to the water sector? The water sector is particularly dependent on nature and the ecosystem services it provides. This includes provisioning services like directly supplying water for drinking, agriculture, industry, and energy generation, regulating services like controlling the quality, quantity, and distribution of water, such as flood regulation, water filtration, erosion control, and climate regulation. Bundled and supporting services like supporting other ecosystem functions and providing habitats for fish and wildlife. And cultural services such as cultural value to First Nations people and recreational tourism. The day-to-day operation of water utilities relies on the continued function and health of rivers, aquifers, wetlands, and their surrounding ecosystems to ensure a reliable supply of clean water for households, agriculture, industry, and other critical uses. At the same time, their activities such as water extraction, infrastructure development, chemical use can harm ecosystems if not managed carefully. So these impacts and dependencies on nature underpin the importance of the natural capital water utilities have and maintain through their land and services. If we take something like the Murray-Darling Basin as an example, this system plays a crucial role in providing water for drinking and agricultural purposes, making its management vital for public health and food production. It also has an important role in regulating the flow and distribution of water, supports significant ecosystem functions and habitats, and provides significant cultural and recreational value. So on to the last slide in this section. Based on this, we really explore in the paper the benefits that might come from the integration of a natural capital approach into planning and decision making, with a particular focus on the water sector. We touch on benefits like risk mitigation. We're having a better understanding of the risks associated with depleting or degrading natural capital can help prevent long-term economic and environmental consequences and build resilience against such risks. There can also be economic benefits through identifying cost savings and new revenue streams through ecosystem services, such as flood protection, ecotourism, and biodiversity credits. And with increasing emphasis on environmental regulation and reporting standards, businesses and organisations adopting a natural capital approach can align with evolving requirements and demonstrate their commitment to responsible environmental stewardship. And importantly, this approach can foster stronger relationship with stakeholders, including investors, consumers, and communities, by showcasing balanced decisions and commitment to sustainable and restorative practices. Given the use of natural capital approaches is increasingly recognised and adopted by organisations to measure the economic value of ecosystem services, we looked at some of the lessons from the UK's adoption and integration of this approach across the water sector, where they've been championing the use of a natural capital approach to achieve broad biodiversity and environmental outcomes through a comprehensive policy and legislation agenda for over a decade. And so with that introduction, I'd like to pass over to Valerie to take us through some of the successes and challenges of adopting a natural capital approaches in the UK.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council for hosting this webinar. I'm delighted to be here today and to have contributed to the paper where we share some of the learnings and challenges and lessons along the way that we've gathered from adopting natural capital approaches in the UK thus far. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting, if I may. As Emma has already pointed out, natural capital is a concept which revolves around the idea that the natural world produces goods and services that are essential to life. And it sounds fairly obvious. It's something we all understand, at least at some level. The problem comes from the fact that the value of natural capital is not reflected in our economic decisions. And it's this idea that conventional measures of economic growth and prosperity, so to speak, do not account for the depreciation of natural assets. And I think we all recognize the truth is that our global natural capital stocks are severely in decline, and yet GDP, gross domestic product, which is the common indicator of economic health, continues to increase broadly, which can't continue forever. Recent estimates from the UK's review on the economics of biodiversity, called the Dasgupta Review by Partha Dasgupta, has shown that we're consuming about 1.7 times the planetary resources that are available. And again, I'm not a mathematician, but we don't need to understand math to a complex degree to understand that that's not sustainable. So the terminology around natural capital was first used around the 1970s to persuade economists to take the environment into account, and it became widely used by ecological economists in the early 90s. But it was around the kind of 2000s when the landmark Millennium Ecosystems Assessment was published, and this really had three key findings. Firstly, that over the last 50 years, humans have changed ecosystems at a more rapid rate than any other period in history, mostly to meet the demands for food and water and other resources. And this has led to a significant loss of biodiversity and ecosystem degradation. The second finding is that the assessment emphasizes the benefits that humans derive from ecosystems, and highlighted that while well-being has generally improved, it has come at the cost of ecosystem health. And the third finding is it warned that if these current trends continue, the ability of ecosystems to sustain future generations will be compromised. So, largely in response to that, the UK formed the Natural Capital Committee in 2012 as an independent advisory body to help the government better understand and manage and value the country's national assets. And the first kind of job that the committee had was to push for the inclusion of natural capital into our national accounting systems to help policymakers really recognize the economic value of nature and also the cost of environmental degradation, to factor that into decision making. And it was around that time that the UK started to develop an approach and gather data and started publishing partial natural capital accounts, which sit alongside our national accounts that the Office for National Statistics publish annually to describe and measure our production income and our wealth. And during its second term, the Natural Capital Committee then played a central role in shaping the UK government's 25-year environment plan. And it's at this point where I think really the terminology around natural capital became embedded in our kind of everyday lexicon. If you were to do a word search of that document, the 25-year environment plan, I think natural capital is mentioned around 70 times, something like that, in that order of magnitude. And from there, the first full natural capital account was then published in 2019. And then following on from that, the Treasury updated its central government policy and appraisal guidance, which is referred to as the Green Book in the UK, and it's kind of like the Bible for economists. And that was updated to include an approach for how to incorporate natural capital and ecosystem services into decision making. And it includes, numerous sources of evidence for monetizing or capturing the monetary value of those ecosystem benefits, so that they can be included as a line item within any economic appraisal, cost benefit analysis, the way all other impacts are pretty much all already being captured. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on some of the lessons and successes and challenges that we've experienced along the way. I would say that, keep bearing in mind that none of this is perfect and being adopted consistently in every situation. However, the current state of our journey is that we have a number of we have a multifaceted approach, I would say, to embedding natural capital thinking, and that's demonstrated in a variety of ways. Firstly, we have that policy integration and guidance. As I mentioned, the UK government has embedded natural capital thinking into policy appraisal through the Green Book, and has developed a series of tools for capturing and measuring ecosystem value and benefits. And these tools help policymakers to assess environmental impacts alongside economic and social ones. And in theory, that then elevates natural capital and environmental considerations, to the same level as all other kind of policy aspects. The second aspect is we do have strategic planning and evaluation that also integrates natural capital thinking. It's now central to the environmental improvement plan, which you might expect, but it's also present in a number of other broader government strategies. So, for example, the National Infrastructure Commission is developing a set of natural capital principles to guide infrastructure planning and delivery. And the principles will be embedded into the second National Infrastructure Assessment to influence future investment decisions and project approvals. And we have annual progress reports and outcome indicators that track how policies affect natural assets and ecosystem services. And we've recently set up a public body called the Office for Environmental Protection, which provides that independent oversight of the government's progress. Reports against these. Again, I would say, none of this is perfect or as consistent as it needs to be yet, but it gives a flavor of kind of the commitment that we've made in the UK to natural capital thinking. The third one is around the expansion of market mechanisms. So as Emma's touched upon, natural capital approaches do enable some revenue generating opportunity through valuing ecosystem service benefits. And the UK is scaling up some of these markets through developing things like nature-based carbon codes. So we already have a woodland carbon code and a peatland carbon code, which enable landowners and land managers to develop and monetize ecosystem service restoration benefits. And we're developing new methodologies all the time. So we've got a soil carbon code in production, a hedgerow restoration code, as well as an emerging UK salt marsh code. And that will provide, a diverse range of investment opportunities for landowners to take advantage of. We also recently launched a statutory biodiversity market under the policy called Biodiversity Net Gain in the UK, which requires developers to deliver a 10% minimum gain in biodiversity for any new development that goes through planning. And that has, fostered a market around the trading and selling, of biodiversity credits. Alongside that, we're seeing, increases in nature positive investments. 2025 is no exception. There's been a rise in nature positive funds, which are a type of investment vehicle that aim to deliver financial returns while also restoring biodiversity and ecosystem health. And, the UK, as with the kind of global market, reflects that, you know, it's still a market that's in its infancy, but much like, as I say, the rest of the world, but the evidence is there that it is starting to scale up. And lastly, there is evidence of public-private collaboration, and the UK government is actively trying to foster more of that collaboration between sectors, with policies like Biodiversity Net Gain that I mentioned, the Nature Restoration Fund, which is designed to align development with environmental improvements. There's also what's called the Big Nature Fund, which is providing seed funding to pay for those kind of startup costs when projects and markets and initiatives are kind of in their infancy. A lot of times that the kind of startup cost is kind of the main challenge. So the government's providing some of that seed funding to hopefully allow some of this to become more self-sustaining. Next slide, please. Great. So the paper that we're launching, there's a number of case studies in the paper. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of them today. They're both kind of watery examples. This is, you know, practical lessons from real UK projects and case studies. So the first example is where nature has been central to effective decision making in the development, the design of a project in the water sector. I would say this could apply to any infrastructure project, but as we've already touched upon, as Emma mentioned, we think there's a strong reason why the water sector has been a first adopter, and, you know, really highlighting the fact that the impacts and dependencies on the natural environment are very clear in the water sector, and I think that's a good indication of why they've been an early adopter. So this particular example is around the development of a new reservoir in the UK. We are currently embarking on a whole reservoir program, building a number of new reservoirs, the first for several decades. And there's been a task force set up to kind of streamline that process and make sure that it's as efficient as possible, while also really taking advantage of the opportunity that you know, these major infrastructure projects have to deliver environmental benefits. So this particular water utility in England, Jacobs and the UK is working with to develop a new reservoir, and what that looked like, and, you know, initially there was a multi-stage natural capital assessment, and at concept design stage, this was largely qualitative. So we looked at multiple infrastructure configurations to consider how habitats would be affected by a change in land use and how that would therefore impact on ecosystem service benefits. And these results were scored and assessed and combined with other outputs from environmental assessments to ultimately inform the selection of the preferred option. And then later, and at the detailed design stage, we took detailed GIS data on habitats and land cover and undertook a more comprehensive natural capital assessment that included quantifying and monetizing impacts on ecosystem services on a handful of the most relevant ecosystem services, both for the project and for the organization and the kind of contextual environment. So we monetize water quality benefits, natural hazard or flood reduction benefits, food production, recreation, as well as air pollutant removal. And I think it's important to emphasize that we're talking about both gains and losses in ecosystem services. So typically where you have any sort of habitat creation project, and a reservoir is ultimately a habitat creation project, you're going to also lose habitat. You're going to be displacing another type of habitat. So it's not going to be gains across the board. And I really think that that's an advantage of the natural capital approach, is it provides a good way of scaling and understanding the trade-offs between various habitats and design decisions, to really optimize you know, the benefits and ecosystem services that are most needed in that area. And also, you know, I think we've also touched on the fact that natural capital approaches allow you to express benefits, environmental benefits or losses in economic terms, and that will support business cases, and it provides that justification that the preferred option will actually deliver value for society, which should help the schemes to stand up to scrutiny as they pass through planning consent also. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. This second case study is an example of how leveraging natural capital benefits can demonstrate multiple objectives and ultimately to attract funding. So this project is called the Sandway Byfleet Flood Alleviation Scheme in the UK, and it was developed by the Environment Agency in partnership with several of the local councils, the Wildlife Trust, as well as Thames Water, which is the water utility in the area, and local community groups. The scheme, as you might expect, is the primary driver is to reduce flooding from the River Wey to nearby properties in the Sandway area. And it involved constructing new flood walls, embankments, storage areas, as well as a series of environmental and community enhancements. And I would say that much like many other flood schemes, the original economic appraisal focused on what I would say are the traditional kind of costs and benefits that you would expect to see. So the primary benefit of the scheme that was being captured was property protection, and those natural capital benefits weren't being reflected, and that is one of the reasons why the original economic appraisal didn't have that magic benefit cost ratio that economists like to see. So generally, you'd want to see a benefit cost ratio of greater than 1, which suggests that for every pound or dollar that you're investing in the scheme, you're getting at least a dollar back in value. And that wasn't the case initially for this project. So the Jacobs team helped to capture and assess some of those wider ecosystem service benefits that the scheme was already delivering, such as enhancing existing areas of grassland, creating a new area of wetland, and critically, it was about improving access to green space and that connectivity between green space to enhance recreational value. So by capturing and monetizing those benefits, it helped the business case. It made the scheme appear viable, which it was a viable case, and ultimately the natural capital benefits, particularly the welfare benefit from that improved recreational access that I mentioned, it helped to secure funding for the scheme, and it really brought more partners on board and fostered a more collaborative approach. Ultimately, the scheme's been taken forward and is being delivered for the benefit of the community. So those are just 2 examples. I'm now going to pass back to Emma to talk about how natural capital approaches are relevant in the ANZ context. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. So just on to the next slide. What does this all mean for us here in Australia and New Zealand? As I mentioned at the start, around half of the GDP of both Australia and New Zealand is moderately or highly dependent on nature and the ecosystem services it provides. I think the UK's journey really highlights some of those challenges and successes that they've had of adopting this approach, and enables us to reflect on how they might be applied here. If I reflect on some of the key takeaways that I had during the development of this paper, kind of centered around sort of four key areas. The first is around the importance of understanding the baseline of impact and dependencies that you have on nature. With the diversity of ecosystems and natural assets across Australia and New Zealand, improving the knowledge of the natural capital baseline can help improve the understanding of the landscapes that we're operating in and support prioritising areas of highest impact. The importance of local context in approach was also critical, whether that be legislative frameworks or, importantly in our region, the consideration of Indigenous and First Nations cultural values around water and country is really critical. Thirdly, the potential for a natural capital approach to support the unlocking of funding and investment in nature-based solutions and restoration activities is a big opportunity. And Valerie touched on a case study that was related to that. And in the paper, we've also presented a case study from Yarra Valley Water that really showcases a powerful example of how some of these approaches can bring together critical stakeholders to deliver multiple benefits to the ecosystem services of a site. And as we look to the UK's evolving policy and regulatory environment in this space, I think it gives us an insight into what might come here. We're already seeing substantial effort in environmental and nature-related forms across Australia and New Zealand to varying degrees. and increasing focus on things like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So we hope this paper can demonstrate some of these points and support further conversations about the value of integrating a natural capital approach across planning and decision-making in the sector. And with that covers the main content of our presentation today. So I'll pass back through to Kerry to manage our Q&A.
Great, fantastic. Thanks to both Emma and Valerie for going through the content of the paper and really sharing their thoughts and learnings with all of us today. We've got some great questions, so I'm going to kick those off. First off, I'll direct one to you, Valerie. When political agendas and global crises threaten environmental progress, should industries pause, adapt, or push ahead aggressively in valuing natural capital? And what's the UK water sector's experience in navigating this tension? I'm sure we're all feeling this tension around us, not just in the nature space, but in generally around environmental areas. So it'd be really fascinating to get your response to that.
Yeah, no, that is a really great question, and it's certainly come up in a number of different contexts and recently. I would say, you know, that in general, natural capital approaches, if anything, are even as you might expect, even more important when the kind of climate, the political climate is as it is just now, and I think it's similar in various different areas across the globe. But I think what it arms you with is that evidence base for, you know, that this isn't really, you know, it's not a CSR, it's not a corporate social responsibility type agenda, that it really is about you know, underlying economic decisions and affecting companies and organizations' bottom line, and that, you know, it's about risk reduction, it's about all of those things that are very tangible to decision makers and CFOs and the like, and it sits really outside of the political agenda, I think, in that respect. So the more that we can highlight either where, you know, natural capital approaches can be used to demonstrate that there's been cost savings, that you're delivering more for less, but also that risk reduction bit is really been really important, and will be increasingly so. So, you know, for example, there's a strong emphasis on some of those important ecosystem services that provide risk reduction benefits. So things like flood risk reduction, urban cooling, you know, things like that are, you know, kind of inarguable in a sense. So I think it's even more important now than it ever has been.
Fantastic, thanks. I've got a question. I'm going to kick off with you, Emma, and then Valerie, you might want to add to it. But the first question that came through, and it's really also related to this kind of political environment, kind of environmental setbacks, but what practical steps can organisations take to safeguard and advance natural capital initiatives over the next decade, given the context within which we're in? So do you want to kick off on that, Emma?
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's a good and related question. I think some of the case studies sort of touch on some of those things around, you know, identifying mutual stakeholders and multiple benefits of a site that might unlock access to funding and investment. So I think through the natural capital approach and putting that value on nature, it can actually help, you know, unlock that funding or additional funding to invest in some of those initiatives. And so I think that's one practical step that could kind of help with safeguarding those measures.
Right. Valerie, anything from you in terms of practical steps for organisations?
Yeah, I mean, I think practical steps for organizations, you know, again, in the current climate, we've kind of touched on a little bit here already, but I think understanding your baseline and your context, looking for, as you say, efficiencies in data or information that's already being gathered. It doesn't necessarily require, you know, something that's completely from scratch. You know, I think like you know, I can draw parallels like with TNFD and other nature-related assessment frameworks. It's it's about the intent, and it doesn't have to be perfect and comprehensive the first time round. So just even by getting a high level understanding of the types of habitats that are going to be impacted, the types of ecosystem services that you're either gaining or losing. It doesn't have to be a fully comprehensive monetized assessment in initially, although that can really help. But just starting to apply some of that thinking and understanding trade-offs is really beneficial.
You raised then the TNFD, and I know within our organisation we're seeing a number of members who are starting to voluntarily report against the TNFD. Do you see the natural capital approach helping businesses in the UK in particular with their reporting and responding to TNFD requirements?
Yeah, I think in particular where organizations have their own operational footprint, it's really, really helpful. So, when we've applied the LEAP approach within TNFD, which is about locate, evaluate, assess, et cetera, it is trickier when you have when your majority of your impacts that you've identified are global and they're perhaps somewhere else in your value chain. But when you have a large land holding and you have direct impacts on habitats and ecosystems because of your own operations, applying that natural capital thinking can really be beneficial. And I think the water sector is a really good example of that. So the water utility and the companies in the UK generally are large landholders, and so by identifying some of their risks and dependencies through a TNFD approach, we can identify opportunities to use their own land holdings to offset some of those risks and opportunities, which is kind of a win-win.
Great, thanks. A question for you, Emma, from Jason. What would your suggestions for the inclusion of natural capital as part of the environmental reform agenda be? Does the nature repair market go far enough?
Yes, the nature repair market and the ongoing reforms we've got here in Australia. I think the nature repair market, which was launched earlier this year, I definitely think if it can be formed into a well-functioning biodiversity market, there's definitely potential for it to, I guess, unlock some of those flows to natural capital and support, the access to the funds through the market. I think it'll be interesting to see where the federal government goes with the further reforms. I've been somewhat keeping track of the latest news in that space and where that's going, but I think it's part of it, but not all of it. So I definitely think there's more that can be done around how it's embedded into some of those reforms and how we're showing the value of nature.
Great, thanks for that. Valerie, I'm going to get the question that Janine has asked around valuing whether you see the value in defining shadow dollar costs or pound costs in your case of natural capital across a whole organisation, not just at the project specific level. So similar to what we do in the carbon area.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think ideally you'd have both. You'd have those kind of bottom up approaches as well as top down, and the challenges in linking up the two. So again, the water sector is a good example. We undertake project level natural capital assessments and capture and quantify those ecosystem service values. And we, many water companies in the UK have also adopted either a multi-capitals accounting system or just a standalone natural capital account where they report organization wide on their kind of the gross, or sorry, the net value of their ecosystem service benefits and natural capital stocks, etc. I think, as I say, that the challenge is in making the project level assessments then seamlessly feed into those organizational level reporting. And in terms of developing a shadow cost, we do have a fairly comprehensive, there's still gaps in it, but we do have a good evidence base for monetizing ecosystem service values in the UK for most of our prevalent habitats. But interestingly, what we're seeing with the rise of nature markets is that, you know, clients or organizations that do have large land holdings that aren't necessarily wanting to generate, for example, carbon benefits to sell, you know, to trade nature-based carbon removal credits, whether that's a woodland credit or something else, are looking to develop approaches that are scientifically robust, that are verifiable, but that where they can use their own land holdings to meet their net zero targets through insetting. So that's an example of, you know, where you can calculate the cost of a habitat creation scheme and compare that to other routes to achieving their net zero target, and therefore they kind of have their own shadow costs embedded into their decision making. And there's a similar kind of thinking along the lines of biodiversity net gain as well. So again, where organizations need biodiversity credits for their to meet their planning and development needs, they're thinking, well, can we fulfill that requirement using our own land holdings, and how does that compare with the costs and benefits of generating a biodiversity unit on our own land? How does that compare with purchasing them on the BNG market? So again, that's another example of where that kind of implicit shadow pricing kind of exists and is emerging as well. So there's some interesting things going on around there.
Great, thanks so much. Emma, there's a question here from Roger. Hi, Roger. How do we ensure that our valuing nature accounts not only for ecosystem services and inherent biodiversity values, but also for the relational value of nature in kinship and country? And you mentioned that a little in your presentation about that being one of the drivers and benefits, I guess, but how do we bring that into the system itself, perhaps? Any thoughts on you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and thank you, Roger, for raising it. It's definitely was a key thing that came up as we started to understand and unpack, you know, the UK's approach and their methodologies around natural capital, and then thinking around, well, how does that translate and apply to the context that we've got both across Australia and New Zealand, and definitely acknowledge that it's an incredibly important element of you know, placing value on nature and the ways that that, you know, First Nations people and you know, and how country is defined in that way. We acknowledged it and touched on it in the paper, and it's actually, I think, based on, you know, the development of the paper and going through these case studies, it's prompted in me that there's probably a whole other, I guess, stage or process to kind of unpacking that a little bit more. And I'd really, you know, love to start now, you know, exploring exactly that a little bit more. You know, how do we make sure that it's meaningfully accounted in assessments? And, you know, even that, you know, can we even put a financial value on some of those things, or is it something that needs to be accounted in an entirely different way? So I don't think there's an answer to that exactly yet, but I really think it's something that we need to start considering and making sure that it doesn't get excluded from assessments because of, you know, that there's not a clear way of including it.
Great. I think that's a great reflection. As you say, Emma, not something that is an easy response to, but it's certainly important both in the Australian and New Zealand context. And Ross has asked a question which is going a little outside the water sector, I guess. You know, obviously that's the focus of the paper, but just a question around how projects that might be more like a gas field project, how this type of thinking would play out in terms of incorporating natural capital assessment into a different style of project.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one to kind of consider across the different sectors. I think, you know, the water sector was our primary focus because we could see the, you know, the strong parallels and drawing from that UK experience. But we do also see quite strong adoption of natural capital approaches in some of the more of the resources sector. So I haven't looked as much into, I guess, oil and gas sector, but I have seen within the resources sector some of the organisations that play in that space also starting to use natural capital and building it into both their, you know, looking at their TNFD alignments, but also looking at the different interventions and restoration activities that they're undertaking. So there might be some parallels there that could be drawn into the oil and gas sector as well.
I would just jump in and add to that you know, certainly in the UK, as I say, the water sector has been an early adopter, and that's partly for the reasons that have already been stated, but it's partly been policy driven as well. So we have, you know, the water and utilities regulator in the UK requires natural capital assessment into business planning, and it's in the national policy statement for water infrastructure. However, environmental net gain, which is a concept around, you know, demonstrating an increase in the overall ecosystem service value, is also included in the recent update to the energy national policy statement. So we've yet to see this really play out in terms of oil and gas development, but certainly in energy transmission projects, you know, there is a need to demonstrate an overall gain in ecosystem service values. Again, I think it's, you know, it probably is trickier than other sectors. I would draw parallels as well with the transport sector. So we do a lot of work. The UK team does a lot of work for National Highways and Transport Scotland. And, you know, the roads aren't particularly low carbon inherently and aren't necessarily nature based, but you can, you know, we've demonstrated that, you know, that if a road scheme or any kind of infrastructure scheme is designed well, it can actually improve environmental outcomes, and, you know, even capturing the value of things that we were already doing through environmental mitigation and the like, the, you know, good mitigation design, capturing those benefits better, and then optimizing them through you know, tweaks to that design, has, you know, really been a good way of engaging clients and stakeholders around that.
Great, thanks, Valerie. There's a question here around private sector, attracting private sector funding. And so I'll kick off this one with yourself, Valerie, but then Emma, you might want to respond to the second part of the question. So a key challenge in the water sector is the limited ability of existing organisations, water corps, etc., to realise additional funding beyond existing obligations. To what extent has natural capital assessment enabled water corporations in the UK being able to attract to private sector funding? So Valerie, if you want to pick that up, and then the second part of the question is around changes in legislative instruments, obligations, economic frameworks that would be needed to transfer that into ANZ.
Yeah, so I mean, again, it's a really good question, and I'd say it's happening to a degree organically as well as being policy driven. So, you know, reflecting on that water sector example again, I think it's fair to say that in the UK as well as in the ANZ region, there's this growing awareness of the need to manage whole catchments, and that ultimately relies on not just the water utility, but a whole range of players across the entire landscape. And the challenge is, you know, then to foster some of that collaboration. It is happening in pockets, especially where there's clear linkages between an impact and a landowner or a dependency in a landowner, but the challenge is more around diffuse, you know, issues where it is still a challenge, I would argue. So, you know, some of that, as I say, is happening. The market and those partnerships are being created themselves. They're kind of arising themselves, and then in other instances, it is being driven by policy. So the regulator in the UK does require now a certain proportion of water resource management projects to be delivered in partnership. Now, how that actually plays out and the definition of in partnership is slightly questionable, but at least, you know, it does demonstrate that kind of mandate. And similarly, you know, when we talk about flood risk and the Environment Agency, at least in England, you can only now fund, the Environment Agency will now only fund up to 80% of a flood risk management scheme. The rest has to be delivered through partnership funding. So it really drives organizations to go out and find those partners. And we keep hearing about, you know, particularly in the private sector, there is a willing and there's money, but it's just about, you know, finding the right project and the right agreement. And I think that's really where where natural capital approaches can help with that, because it really delineates who is benefiting from some of these projects, and you know, helps to generate some partnership working.
Fantastic. Emma, any comments from you in terms of any changes you think might be required to help facilitate that more?
Yeah, I think Valerie's point around the partnership funding is a really critical one, and I think to an extent you see elements of that already happening quite organically, but I think that element of bringing in partners who either have the financial capital or other kind of capital that they can bring in to support site developments or interventions is really critical. And I think the case study that we talked to for Yarra Valley Water in the paper from their Upper Yarra sewage treatment plant really is a good example of how, by identifying multiple organisations that have shared, I guess, targets or outcomes that they're trying to achieve, and combining that intervention onto one site, not only can bring about those multiple benefits and help everyone achieve their goals, but can also, you know, bring in and pull the funding as well from different organisations and direct it into one area that's going to maximise those outcomes.
Fantastic, thanks. Look, there are a couple more questions here which we will pick up after the webinar, but just want to take the opportunity to close out appropriately. So thanks for everyone for your questions. It's been a great discussion and contribution, I think, to add to what's in the report. So let me just close then by thanking everyone for attending today and for your great questions. And we really hope that you get real value in reading the report and looking through that in terms of the more in-depth information that's provided in the paper. And please feel free to contact Emma or myself or Valerie if you have any follow-up questions from that. IEC and Jacobs would really like to thank our presenters, Emma and Valerie, and to all those from the Jacobs and IEC teams who supported the paper launch and today's webinar. Really encourage you to view or download the paper using the QR code that's here on your left. You can see where you can download that. And we'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to provide feedback on the event. There's a QR code there on the right, and there'll just be a couple of questions in terms of the webinar and event that we've hosted today. We really appreciate hearing from you. We'll send out a recording of the webinar and a link to the report in the next day or so. So let me just finally thank everyone for your participation, for being with us over the last hour, for all of those who have contributed to the support to this paper and report, and wish everyone well out there in our ongoing engagement around enhancing natural capital. Thanks so much. Ka kite anō.